You reach for something sweet almost every day without thinking about it. A spoonful in your coffee, a candy from a jar on someone's desk, a soda that fizzes the second you crack it open. It feels modern. It feels manufactured. But the real answer is far stranger. 10,000 years before any of that, a small group of people on a tropical island were already chewing on a wild grass, and what they found inside it would eventually reshape the entire world's diet, economy, and even its wars. You were not there, but your body still remembers what they discovered. Picture the island first. Thick jungle, warm wet air that never really cools down. Rivers cutting through volcanic soil so rich, it seems to grow anything you drop into it. This is New Guinea, long before it had that name, long before anyone wrote anything down. And somewhere in that jungle, a wild grass was growing tall with thick jointed stalks, almost bamboo-like, catching the sun. Nobody knows the exact moment. There is no single hero in this story, no lightning bolt discovery. But archaeobotanist Dorian Fuller, who has spent years tracing the origins of domesticated plants across Asia and the Pacific, has argued that people in New Guinea were selecting and cultivating this grass as early as 8,000 years before your time. Not for medicine, not for building, for taste. Try to imagine that world before this happened. No farms anywhere on the planet yet. No livestock penned in fields. Just small bands of people moving through forest and floodplain, reading the land the way you might read a map, knowing exactly which tree fruited in which month, which root could be dug safely from the mud, which leaf would make a person sick. Into that world of careful, hard-won knowledge, a stalk of wild grass offered something different. Not survival food exactly, not medicine, something closer to pure, uncomplicated pleasure. Think about that for a second. Long before wheat was farmed in the Fertile Crescent, before rice was domesticated in China, people in this remote jungle had already found something sweet enough to be worth the effort of growing on purpose. Why would that matter so much to them? Because your ancestors' brains were built to crave it. Sugar means calories. Calories mean survival. A tongue that lights up at sweetness was a tongue that kept its owner alive during a lean season. And evolution does not forget a trick that works. Every animal that has ever chased down a piece of ripe fruit was running on the same ancient wiring that made a stalk of wild cane irresistible the moment someone bit into it. So they bit into it. Hard, fibrous, almost impossible to eat raw as food, but that was never the point. You do not eat the stalk. You crush it, or you simply chew and suck, and the juice runs out sweet and thick, unlike anything else growing nearby. Imagine being the first person to taste that. No refined sugar had ever existed anywhere on Earth. This was, for a very long time, the sweetest thing a human being could put in their mouth. They started replanting the stalks. Not from seed, since sugarcane rarely produces seeds that grow true, but from cuttings, sections of the stem pushed back into the soil to sprout again. This is one of the oldest examples of vegetative propagation anywhere in the archaeological record. In plain terms, that means growing a new plant from a piece of an old one instead of a seed, the same way you might grow a new houseplant today from a single cutting in a glass of water. Your ancestors were doing this with sugarcane while much of the rest of humanity hadn't. Domesticated a single crop. Notice what this required. Patience, planning, the kai, willingness to set aside a piece of something you already enjoyed today, bury it in the dirt, and wait an entire growing season for it to become useful again. That is not the behavior of someone simply foraging for calories. That is the behavior of someone organizing their life around a pleasure they already knew was worth protecting. Long before writing, before metal tools, before the wheel reached this part of the world, people had already built a small, quiet agricultural system around the taste of something sweet. For thousands of years, this stayed almost entirely local. Sugarcane spread slowly through the islands of Southeast Asia, carried by people moving in outrigger canoes, trading, settling new coastlines one bay at a time. It reached the Philippines. It reached parts of what is now Indonesia. It drifted as far as the edges of mainland Southeast Asia, tucked into the same canoes that carried yams, taro, and breadfruit across open water. Still, nobody was making sugar as you know it. There was no white crystal, no bag on a supermarket shelf, no sealed packet in a pantry. There was only cane, chewed raw at the source or crushed for its juice. Her treat, rather than an ingredient, something closer to fruit than flour. Picture a coastal village somewhere along this route. generations after the first cultivation began. A child runs to a small planted grove behind the huts, breaks off a stalk taller than she is, and peels back the tough outer rind with her teeth before anyone has to tell her how. She already knows. Everyone in her village already knows. This knowledge has become as ordinary as knowing where the fresh water runs, passed down the same way without ceremony. One generation simply showing the next. Then it reached India, and everything changed again. Somewhere between 2 and 1,000 years before your era, in the river valleys of northern India, people figured out something remarkable. If you boil the juice down over a slow fire, the water evaporates and what's left behind thickens, darkens, and eventually hardens into something you can store, transport and trade months or even years later. That single insight changed everything. Sugar was no longer tied to the harvest. It no longer had to be eaten fresh near the field within days of cutting. It could travel. It could wait. It could become currency. This is the birth of what ancient Sanskrit texts called sharkara, a word that later gave English its word sugar, and gave many other languages their own version of the same root. Not a coincidence. A direct linguistic fossil sitting in your own vocabulary right now, tracing back to a jungle discovery thousands of years old, carried across an ocean of centuries by nothing more than the sound of a word passed from mouth to mouth. Indian texts from this period describe multiple grades of this hardened sugar, some coarse and dark, some pale and fine, each valued differently, each used differently. Coarser grades sweetened everyday cooking. Finer, paler grades were reserved for ceremony, medicine, and gift-giving among people of status. Even at this early stage, sweetness was already becoming a marker of wealth, a substance you could use to signal who you were and what you could afford. Not just something you ate because it tasted good. Here is where the story gets stranger still. When Alexander the Great's army pushed into India around 325 BCE, one of his officers, a naval commander named Nearchus, recorded something his soldiers found almost impossible to believe. He described a reed in India that produced honey without any bees at all. Read that again. Ancient Greek soldiers, standing in a foreign land looking at sugarcane for the first time, had no other way to explain it, except to compare it to something they already understood. Sweetness, to them, only had one source before this moment. Isn't it strange to think that an army marching for conquest stumbled onto something that would eventually outlast every empire it fought for? From India, sugar production moved outward along trade routes. First to Persia, where refinement techniques improved dramatically. Then into the Islamic world, during its golden age of science and agriculture, spreading through Egypt, North Africa, and eventually into Sicily and southern Spain. Scholars and farmers across this world experimented with irrigation systems, pressing techniques and multiple rounds of boiling and crystallizing, slowly turning a jungle grass into something closer to the pale crystal you would recognize today. Each culture that touched it made it a little more refined, a little more valuable, a little more addictive to people who had never tasted anything like it. By the time sugar reached medieval Europe, carried home by returning crusaders and traded through Venetian and Genoese merchants who controlled much of the Mediterranean's commerce, it wasn't a food in any ordinary sense. It was a luxury reserved for royalty and the church, sold in tiny quantities by apothecaries, alongside cinnamon, pepper, and rare medicines, priced like a spice, guarded like treasure. A single cone of refined sugar could be worth more than most people earned in weeks. Physicians prescribed it in small doses, the way a modern doctor might prescribe a costly medication, and wealthy households displayed elaborate sugar sculptures at banquets, purely to announce how much money they could afford to melt down for show. You should sit with that for a moment. Something a Stone Age forager could pull straight out of the ground with bare hands eventually became so rare and so prized that European nobility kept it locked away like gold. The same craving, the same ancient wiring, just a longer supply chain standing between your ancestors and their next bite. And your brain today runs on the exact same circuitry that made all of this happen. Neuroscientist Nicole Avena, who has studied the effects of sugar on the brain's reward system, has shown that sugar can trigger the release of dopamine, the chemical linked to pleasure and motivation, in ways that echo the response seen with certain addictive substances. In plain terms, dopamine is your brain's way of saying, "Do that again." It is the same signal that once told a hunter-gatherer, to remember exactly where that patch of wild cane was growing, to walk the same path back through the jungle without needing a reason beyond the memory of how good it felt the first time. It never really turned off. It just found new triggers, new packaging, new places to hide inside a modern diet. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes something you may have never questioned. A craving is not a flaw in your character. It is not a modern weakness invented by fast food companies, even though those companies have certainly learned to exploit it with remarkable precision. The craving itself is ancient. It predates cities, predates agriculture as most people picture it, predates almost every other human habit you could name. What changed is not the craving. What changed is how easy it became to satisfy it, instantly, constantly, without walking anywhere at all. There's another piece of this that goes even deeper than dopamine. Your ability to taste sweetness at all comes from a specific receptor on your tongue, one that biologist Charles Zucker and his research team helped identify and map in detail. This receptor didn't appear by accident. It evolved because detecting sugar quickly, before anything else, was once a matter of life and death. Ripe fruit ripened before it rotted, sometimes within a single day, and it was often gone before anyone came back for a second visit. Sad narrow window. The people who could taste sweetness fastest, who could detect it from a single bite before checking anything else. Plied first and survived longest, passing that same sharp, fast-triggering tongue down to you. Think about how strange this makes the modern grocery aisle. Every product on that shelf, in a sense, is speaking directly to a receptor that was fine-tuned over millions of years to search for one specific thing in a jungle canopy. That receptor cannot tell the difference between a perfectly ripe piece of fruit hanging from a branch and a brightly wrapped bar manufactured in a factory hundreds of miles away. To your tongue, sweetness is sweetness. The context has changed entirely. The signal has not changed at all. So when you reach for something sweet today, you are not weak. You are not broken. You are running software that is millions of years old, tested across generations of ancestors who needed it to live. The tragedy, if there is one, is not that you crave sugar. It's that sugar used to require effort. A trek into the jungle, a cutting planted and tended for a year, a stalk cut and chewed by hand. Now it requires nothing at all. A wrapper, a tap on a screen, a drive-through window. Think about what that means for the ancient trade routes described earlier, the ones that once carried sugar across continents guarded like treasure, protected by armed escorts, taxed by empires along the way. All of that distance, all of that danger, all of that scarcity has collapsed into a single aisle in a store near you, open at nearly any hour, requiring no negotiation, no risk, no wait. The reward circuit built for rare jungle fruit now fires constantly, all day, every day, because the world removed every barrier your ancestors once had to work around to feel that exact same lift on their tongue. Consider, too, how differently your ancestors experienced this compared to you. For the earliest cane cultivators in New Guinea, sweetness came wrapped in effort. Planting, tending, walking to the grove, breaking the stalk, working it between the teeth to release the juice. Even after refining began in India, sugar still demanded patience, fire, and skilled hands boiling juice down over many hours. Every stage of this long history added friction between craving and reward. Somewhere along the way, in factories and refineries built specifically to remove that friction, the gap closed almost entirely. What once took a season now takes a second. By the time European colonial powers reached the Americas, sugar had become one of the most valuable commodities on the planet. More prized in some markets than gold pulled from the ground, colonial powers cleared vast stretches of Caribbean and South American land specifically to grow it, and demand for cheap, endless labor to work. Those fields became one of the driving forces behind the transatlantic slave trade, a brutal chapter of history built on the same plant your ancestors once cultivated. For simple pleasure in a jungle clearing, millions of lives were shaped, uprooted and destroyed to keep sugar bowls filled in distant cities whose residents rarely thought about where the sweetness came from. What began as a simple discovery, a sweet stalk growing wild near a river, eventually reshaped global trade routes, fueled the rise and fall of empires, funded wars, and left scars that still echo through the present day. A taste can travel farther and darker than anyone who first bit into that stalk could ever have imagined. The same craving that once meant survival for a small band of foragers eventually became powerful enough to reorganize entire continents around its satisfaction. By the 18th and 19th centuries, sugar had gone from royal luxury to something ordinary people across Europe and its colonies could afford in small amounts. And then, with the rise of industrial refining and later, sugar extracted from beets grown in cooler climates, it became cheap enough to appear in nearly everything. Bread, sauces, drinks that had never contained it before. The scarcity that once made sugar a treasure worth guarding in a locked cabinet had simply vanished. And nothing in your biology was ever updated to expect that. Here is the question worth sitting with. If a piece of wild grass could travel from a New Guinea jungle to your kitchen counter, reshaping economies, languages, and even the wiring of your own brain along the way, what does that say about the small ordinary cravings you barely notice in your own life? Maybe nothing you reach for without thinking is ever really that simple. You feel it every time sugar crosses your tongue. That instant lift, that small flicker of pleasure is not new. It is not modern. It is not manufactured, no matter how processed the product in front of you might be. It is the oldest signal your body knows, echoing all the way back through empires and trade ships and apothecary scales, back through Alexander's soldiers mistaking a plant for magic, back through Indian farmers boiling juice into crystal, back to a jungle clearing where someone first bit into a wild grass and felt something they had never felt before. You reach for something sweet almost every day without thinking about it. Now you know exactly why.